Order. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Haddad, Mr. Haid and Dr. Al-Hadid. Thank you very much indeed for coming. If we can start straight off, we'll try and target questions at individuals. If there is something you particularly do want to add to somebody else's answer, please do so, but don't feel you have to repeat yourself, as it were, if somebody else has already covered the area. Royston, you want to start?
Thank you, Chairman. To get straight into it then, which regions of Syria currently have the greatest humanitarian needs, and which parties to the conflict are active in those areas? So any or all would be acceptable for an answer.
Hi. As of today, for us the most strategic situation is in the south of Syria, in Daraa and Quneitra, as the Russians and the regime have launched a new military campaign against the south, and they have just announced that the previous de-escalation agreement is ended. So we are now dealing with tens of thousands of civilians being displaced, while the Jordanian borders are closed and the shelling continue without any possibility to evacuate wounded people or provide protection for those who are stuck in those areas.
Just to add quickly to what my colleague Farouk mentioned, I think it's important to highlight that the humanitarian situation in Syria is quite fluid, and what happens in different areas depends mainly on the military/security situation there. So now Daraa, for example, which is the example that Farouk mentioned, is the hot area where most of the attacks are happening, and the situation is therefore complicated. But if you just look at what happened in other areas, just a few months ago, for example, the rural Damascus was the main area that was targeted by the regime. And this is when we talk about mainly the humanitarian needs that are impacted by the military and security situation. But there are other needs that are, in a way, more difficult to observe when we talk about, for example, the people who live under regime control areas or in regime control areas. Most of those people still have similar humanitarian needs, and their access to those needs depend mainly on where they live and to what extent the regime considers those people to be loyal or not loyal. And another issue is related to the legislations that the regime has been trying to use in order to consolidate its power over not only the territories that were recently captured from other groups, but also the properties in those territories. For example, many people have been talking about Law Number 10, which allows the regime in order to confiscate all the properties that the owners of such properties fail to basically prove their ownership over them. This is another humanitarian issue that is not widely reported. But in general, I think the situation in Daraa is quite complicated. On the other side of Syria, in northern Syria, during the first 3 months of 2018, around 1 million people were recently displaced to that area from other regions. So the situation there is complicated, but we don't hear about it in the news because there is no attacks there right now, although the situation might change after Daraa, and in case the regime decides to basically carry out similar attacks in other areas as well. Thank you.
Can I just follow up to Dr. Al-Habib and ask about the White Helmets and whether the work of the White Helmets has changed since they were formed in 2013?
As my colleague Haid said, the situation in Syria is fluid, and the context is different from region to another. And that affects the types of activities that the White Helmets have to conduct in each area. So in the areas where the regime and its allies focus their attacks, the first priority for the teams of the White Helmets is to do search and rescue and firefighting to save lives of those people. In other areas where there is no shelling or lower level of shelling, they would focus on providing services to the local communities and do some early recovery activities and so on. But the main challenges that the White Helmets have been facing are related first to the deliberate targeting to the medical teams in general and to the White Helmets teams particularly through the double tap attacks as the regime and its allies, they bomb the same area again and again when the rescue workers arrive. Plus the disinformation campaign, which is led mainly by the Russian propaganda in order to undermine the credibility and the legitimacy of the White Helmets and all civil society groups who are proposing a different narrative in Syria. And of course the chemical attacks, which have very damaging impact on the spirits of the people mainly. It's a weapon of fear because people they tend to hide in basements, for example, while the regime used tactical chlorine bombs and as you know the chlorine is heavier than air, so it affects the people who are hiding down in the basements and they have to run away, and that was the most effective tactic by the regime in order to clear neighborhoods which when its ground forces are not able to take over.
I understand that some hospitals were hit in Daraa on Sunday. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is it just the one hospital?
One hospital in Bas el-Harir plus two White Helmet centers. Today we lost a colleague in Bas el-Harir who was killed this morning.
Sorry, who was?
A colleague from the White Helmets teams today. And 2 days ago we lost also another colleague, Saad al-Qadiri. And it's obvious for everybody that it is a deliberate targeting.
Right. Of hospitals and the
of
White
hospitals
Helmets.
and the White Helmets teams.
Okay, and the hospitals are being targeted clearly because they're centres for humanitarian support, and they are being hit by is this Syrian barrel bombs or is this Russian Air Force?
Both. It depends on the situation. We have witnessed and documented many incidents in northern Syria and in the south of bombing hospitals. Some of them were by random shelling by the barrel bombs as a way of collective punishment, and some of them it was obvious that they were deliberately targeted. And at least one of them was targeted by the Russian airstrikes in northern Hama.
Was that the one where David Nott's Skype call to the doctors was intercepted at both ends and they used the Skype call to location find a hospital underground? Or was that another location?
I'm not sure of the incident.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Royce, do you?
I'm all done, thank you.
Of course.
I've got a series of questions to ask you about the humanitarian situation. In light of what you've just told us about the regime, which we know about the tactics used within the regime, the suffering that they are imposing, the level of displacement that's taking place, is there any organisation in the world or a country in the world that has a full assessment of the humanitarian needs in terms of the level of suffering? We see all sorts of numbers. We see the United Nations say that they need $3.51 billion to fund the humanitarian response plan for this year. And as of this month, they've only received something like 27% of that. Who is actually coordinating the humanitarian response? How is humanitarian aid and support being coordinated, getting into some of these really challenging areas? And on top of that, can I also ask about the neighbouring countries? You mentioned Jordan. The border of Jordan is closed. We famously know about the berm. What is going on there? And are neighbouring countries stepping up in the way in which countries like the United Kingdom are funding them to step up and provide the humanitarian support that they should be providing?
Well, I think everybody agrees that the volume of the humanitarian crisis in Syria now is so huge, so big, and it's far beyond the capacity of any regional country or local organizations to meet and handle. The neighboring countries, in principle, all of them, of course, they state that they are not able to host more refugees and they don't have enough resources to provide more assistance. And they call for more aids from the UK, from the US, and from other governments to support them to handle the refugees crisis. Some of those countries deal with the refugees with dignity and protect their rights. Some others, they violate the rights of the refugees and put huge pressures on them to force them to go back and face higher threats inside Syria. Regarding the assessment, excuse me, but I have to say it. We as Syrians, we feel so much frustrated because of so many requests for assessments, and we believe that the catastrophe is obvious for everybody, and no matter how much time we spend through these bureaucratic systems of the UN and the international NGOs, filling questionnaires for them and doing surveys on the ground with the people and assessing the needs and following the prices that change every time and the number of IDPs in each area who move every time. But this just turns to be a big machine that wastes the time and the effort of the people who are so much exhausted. And look at our friends and all governments, especially the UK, to deal with the roots of the problem. And in order to end that catastrophe in Syria, no matter how much millions of pounds you spend from your taxpayers' money, it will not end if you don't deal with the roots of the problem. As long as there is bombing on the people, as long as there is a regime which used collective punishment and starvation as a weapon of war, of course the humanitarian crisis will continue and you will keep paying money without solving it.
If I can add, I think that the main challenge when it comes to assessing the needs on the ground are limited to two main issues. The first one is that most of the humanitarian organizations and actors don't have direct access to people on the ground. Although some of them are based in Damascus, but for example, the regime doesn't allow them to go and cross to rebel-controlled areas in order to assess the situation on the ground. When it comes to rebel-controlled areas, the security situation there doesn't allow many organizations to send staff there, even from the neighboring countries, because there is high risk of one of them might getting killed, and this is why they depend mainly on a network of local groups and activists who are trying to the best of basically their ability to assess the situation, but they are not professional. The second main factor is that the situation on the ground keeps changing all the time, and as I mentioned earlier, in a matter of 3 months, around 1 million new IDPs moved to northern Syria. So by the time the previous report was submitted, it was already outdated because there is a new crisis, and that new crisis is not well reported.
And so can I just ask one final question on the assessments and the support, for want of a better term? You know, if there are assessments being requested endlessly, I'm assuming that there's very little flexibility from the aid coordination, the people that are requesting the information, to fully understand the changing needs and the speed at which needs are changing and the requirements of people on the ground are changing too.
Too much bureaucracy. I can give you an example. Just 5-6 weeks ago, as the regime took over northern Homs in the center of Syria. It was an area under siege for almost 5 years. And at the end, after Eastern Ghouta, the regime focused its efforts on it, and the opposition troops there, they surrendered, and some people were displaced, some people have to hide. We know many local Syrian NGOs who were working in those besieged areas, and they were funded by DFID and other humanitarian funds through international NGOs. those international NGOs have their bureaucratic system of different hubs. So an office in Beirut working on the center, office in Amman working in the south, and office in Turkey, Gaziantep, working in the north. So imagine in that emergency situation, many of the people from those besieged areas, they were displaced, including many of the humanitarian workers who were displaced with them as well. But the funding that was pledged to this community through those field teams, because of the internal bureaucracy within these big international NGOs, it was not flexible to respond to the needs of those IDPs who were displaced to the north.
And they're moving,
Because it takes several months of new proposals and coordination mechanisms, and at the end, people did not get the assistance at the emergency time, despite it was an emergency fund from DFID.
Is the aid getting through?
Some, yes, it depends on the area. For those areas which are close to borders, if the government at the other side of the border is cooperative, it will allow aids. In other cases, it doesn't happen. For some areas which received UN aids from through the cross lines operations from Damascus, we know it faced huge difficulties, and in all documented cases by the UN, the medical equipment were taken by the regime's checkpoint, and the medicines. So, of course, there are still difficulties in access, but it's relatively better in the areas which are close to the Turkish borders or the Jordanian borders.
Thank you.
To follow up on that very briefly, there has been the problem with UN aid or international aid. It's become very politicised, hasn't it? So in opposition areas, effectively the aid is getting stripped out by the Assad regime, so what is meant for opposition areas doesn't get delivered. Is that correct?
In many cases, the UN aids were used as a weapon of war.
Okay.
The regime cut the supplies and prevent the convoys to go for a long time.
Okay.
And then later on, you think it accepts because of the pressure in the Security Council, but at the same time, it sends, and the Russians, they send their committees to negotiate with the people. So they tell the Security Council that now they allow a humanitarian convoy to enter, but at the same time they negotiate the people and blackmail them in order to allow the food to enter. They force them, for example, to raise the flag of the Syrian regime or the picture of Bashar al-Assad.
So you either starve or you accept
Yeah.
Syria.
So they starve the people before they allowing the UN convoys to go, and when they allow them, they use them to get political gains.
Just to add to that, I think the system itself is flawed inside Syria, because for any international humanitarian organization to be able to operate inside Syria, the regime imposes restrictions on, first of all, who they are able to work through, meaning local partners. So they have to work through vetted local partners who are mostly loyal to the regime. Some of them are even affiliated with armed military groups, like Al-Bustan organization, which is owned by the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, the president. And then the other one is to basically not allow those actors to provide aid to rebel-controlled areas. So they are able to control who they work with. They are able to control who the recipients of the aid is, and they are able to restrict the number of areas where they can operate. And all those restrictions are the reason why many Syrian and other humanitarian organizations and observers have been saying from the beginning that the UN aid in Syria is being politicized, and in a way or another is being basically mobilized in order to empower the regime and allow it to sustain itself for a long time.
Leila, can I ask you, are women disproportionately impacted by this conflict, and if so, how?
Definitely. With the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has done a research. We work with Syrian women organizations to look at how the armed conflict is impacting them and how to address it. And our findings can come in very quickly in three areas. The first one is the proliferation of arms and the failure of the rule of law had a huge impact on women. Their spaces have been limited, their ability to move, and any rights that they would have would be severely impacted by the availability of arms, by the use of arms, and by what spaces are left to them in this this situation that is not changing. The second issue is the techniques used in the conflict. Some of the issues that Farouk mentioned, like the systematic targeting of healthcare facilities, the systematic targeting of education facilities, and the extensive use of explosive weapons in highly populated areas, all of these have a particularly gendered impact. A few examples: women's inability to arrive to reach healthcare facilities pose extra impact on them. One of our research showed that 80%. Is that
because they're looking after their children, or
not all? Yeah, some in their reproductive functions. The death through pregnancy and delivery, 80% of deaths through pregnancy and delivery could have been prevented if women could make it to healthcare facilities, which has been blocked by them being targeted or by the use of explosive weapons, which will deny them access to them. Also, when there's so much load on healthcare facilities, usually maternity wards and so on are the first to be closed down because there's an assumption that they're not needed and that the more active war injuries should take priority. The third thing is the length and the exacerbation of violence have had impact on pre-existing inequalities, both legal and those in practice. For example, this huge displacement meant that Syrian women who are not allowed to pass their nationalities ended up in dire situations because they need to flee violence and go to another country, and sometimes them and their children have different nationalities and different visa requirements, and the ability to flee to a country is very different for them, which sometimes meant that they could not pass and so on. Also applies to the ability to reach their documentation or documentation in countries of refugee hosting countries and in displacement becomes a serious issue because sometimes because of these pre-existing inequality, guardianship and so on, they don't have as much authority over themselves and their families, and this has become huge in the conflict situation.
Thank you.
Ian.
Thank you. Yeah. I'd like to ask for your views on what happened in 2013. I'm wondering what effect the failure to respond to the use of chemical weapons, when chemical weapons were first used in Syria in 2013. What effect do you think the failure to respond to that had on the conflict in Syria? I don't know who would like to pick that up first.
Well, the first obvious impact is that it allowed the regime not only to continue to use chemical attacks, but to increase the frequency and to basically amplify the scale of those attacks. And that has been quite clear in different reports, but there was a recent one that was published by Human Rights Watch in April this year, which mentioned that out of the 85 attacks they were able to verify between August 2013, which is the big attack that took place that year, and March 2018. They were able to count 85 attacks. The regime is responsible for the vast majority of those attacks. Other attacks were carried out by ISIS, while the remaining attacks were still perpetrators for the remaining attacks are still unidentified. But clearly the regime is the one who's responsible for the vast majority of attacks, and this is only on the chemical attacks level. When it comes to other types of attacks, the regime has been able to use different types of conventional and unconventional attacks to increase the suffering of civilians on different places, and to basically be able to use unconventional weapons like starvation, systematic targeting of civilian facilities and stuff in order to force civilians to submit. So it allowed the regime to increase the level and scale of violence in different areas and to use that with impunity. Another one is it allowed radical groups to use the chemical attack as a recruiting tool to say that Assad used this prohibited weapon that America and many others have been saying that this is the red line, and if something like that happens, we will react. And when it happened, they didn't react to it, which means that they don't care about you, and we are the only ones who are able to protect you. So if you look at basically the capacity of radical groups inside Syria, it increased dramatically after 2013, and that was a turning point for them.
The recruitment by radical groups.
Sorry?
You said the recruitment by radical groups.
Exactly.
Okay.
And when it comes even to civilians, I think that was a big disappointment moment. I was in Syria after the attack took place, and I was there when President Obama was still saying that we will basically carry out strikes in Syria. And during the time I spent there, it was clear that the regime was terrified. The regime stopped many of the airstrikes. The regime had basically to move most of its weapons from one area to another. Many of its military officers left their positions and went to the countryside. They were terrified in general, and that basically led to a high level of decrease significantly the level of attacks by the regime on civilians, and people there were quite hopeful. And then when the Americans decided not to attack, the regime immediately increased its attacks on civilians, and that's when people there felt that the international community in general and the Americans in particular have abandoned them.
So can I just ask you a point in action? I think a very important one. So the price of inaction at that point was twofold. It was to increase the regime's willingness to kill civilians, and it was to increase the attractiveness of radical groups.
Exactly, but also allowed the regime allies to increase the level of participation and involvement inside Syria and outside of Syria.
Right.
For example, the Russians intervened in Syria in 2015, in September 2015. The Iranians increased dramatically their basically involvement and support for foreign militias who are fighting alongside the regime dramatically after that. So it impacted also basically the willingness of the regime supporters to be more involved, because that was
it made
the
it more
time.
attractive and less dangerous.
Exactly.
Okay. The reason I ask that is because the price of inaction is something that is not factored in, and I'm aware that our chairman has written on that as well, which is why I raise that now as a specific issue. So the price of inaction was significant, and you think severe, to the conflict in Syria.
Exactly.
May I add something?
Come on, Doctor.
I would like to highlight 2 points in this regard. First, we believe that the impact of inaction goes beyond Syria. It's not only inside Syria. It actually encouraged Russia to interfere in Ukraine, and it will encourage all autocrats and dictators all over the world to feel impunity, that they can do whatever they want, even using chemical weapons and all kinds of atrocities without any consequences. So this is damaging to the whole human rights system in all the world, not only in Syria. Second, I believe, of course, the first driving and fueling factor to the extremism in the region is the continuous bloodshedding and killing by the regime itself. But the second factor, I believe, is the failure of the international community, and especially the countries that have responsibility to protect civilians, their failure in honoring their commitment. So crossing the red line in 2013, that was a key message to the extremists in Syria, as also the failure of the de-escalation agreement in southern Syria now, because the extremists always accuse the moderate groups inside Syria of being agents to the West or betrayals, or that they listen to the advices from Western countries more than listening to the voices of their people who suffer. And in all occasions, the moderate groups who wanted to distance themselves from the extremist group, they faced that argument. And what happens later on that the extremist groups use that failure, the inaction, to tell the people, look, those who listen to the liberal world will fail you, and we are the only ones who will stay and try to protect you. And that helped the extremists a lot.
Very quickly, just to take your point a little bit further, you've just outlined three consequences of failure of inaction. Do you think, if we, looking back at 2013, that inaction led to effectively a breakdown from the international community and the United Nations around the whole principles of the responsibility to protect? Because clearly, extremism and expansionism flourished afterwards, and of course the international community didn't intervene and have since just been focused on humanitarian aid.
Yes, of course. Plus other hundreds and maybe millions of refugees who would not have been displaced if something happened in 2013.
Okay.
So many lives were killed.
Sorry, did you want to come in?
I just want to make a quick addition on the use of chemical weapons and on what can actually be done. The resource that Hayat mentioned, the 85 attacks that happened since 2013, has been collected by 7 resources, many of them related to the Organization of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the joint investigation mission with the UN. Unfortunately, in 2017, the mandate of this mission has been stopped due to a veto. By the Russian. And as we had the trend that's happening at the Security Council now, 12 resolutions on Syria have been vetoed by Russia. 10 of them have been proposed by the UK. And particularly on this investigation mission, which unfortunately means that now we will not be able to attribute the chemical weapons that continued since 2017. As we speak, there's 192 states gathering in The Hague to look at the Convention of the Chemical Weapons Convention and what can be done in this, taking this failure into consideration.
You're aware that the Foreign Secretary is in The Hague at the moment arguing for the OPCW to name perpetrators. Yeah.
Exactly. So to name perpetrators and to create alternative methods to face this failure that is happening. And this is a very good opportunity, but this could be taken further into other measures that are being failed through to lack of political will and international deadlock.
Mike.
On that point, perhaps you're more up to date than I am. I saw a report earlier today that the Russians were in a very isolated position, that only 9 countries had lined up with them in the meeting. Out of the 192 you mentioned, is that correct?
That is correct. But unfortunately, that will not reflect into the Security Council.
No, of course.
And you wanted to?
Just to follow up on that, when I took a group of members of Parliament to see the Russian ambassador during the battle in Aleppo, and I asked him why the Russians had bombed the hospitals, his answer was, they weren't hospitals. So I said, what were they? And he said, they were jihadist training camps. What would you say to that?
Well, the one thing, so many bad things are happening in Syria. One of the things where the Syria conflict is slightly different from other conflicts around the world. Sorry, yes. One particular characteristic of the Syrian conflict is the amount of documentation that took place. Despite the systematic denial of access to the Commission of Inquiry, to other UN-mandated bodies and international organizations working on documentation, we have a huge body of documentation. There's trend proven of systematic human rights violations and crimes against humanity. This is what has pushed the UN to look at the Commission of Inquiry findings and to now look at the IIIM, the new mechanism on identifying perpetrators. So such arguments are used all the time. We know that we don't know every attack that happened in Syria happened by who, because we're denied access, and most international mandated fact-finding missions are denied access, but we know there's enough to prove a trend. That hospitals have been targeted, that they are targeted systematically, and that they are worsening the humanitarian situation to the extent that is creating one of the biggest displacement and refugee influx in a very long time.
But just to add to that, I think it's important to highlight that the intervention, the Russian intervention in Syria didn't only allow the regime to continue to target civilian facilities such as hospitals, schools, and markets, but the Russians themselves did that. And one clear example is what happened in my hometown in November 2017, where all evidence point to that fact that the Russians were the one who carried out 3 air attacks on a market, civilian market in my hometown, and killed around 69 civilians. There were no military bases there, and the attack was, the 3 attacks were one at the beginning of the market, one at the end of the market, and one at the middle of the market, to cause as many casualties among civilians as possible. So there are many proven evidence that, and reports that have documented that the Russian direct basically targeting of civilian facilities. What we, I think, are missing so far is to act upon the reports that we have been collecting for years and years, and to hold the Russians accountable for their actions, not only in Syria but elsewhere as well. And I think the other issue that the UK and other European countries can invest in is to start saying that you always say that this attack was not done by you. I think those countries have the capacity to be able to provide intelligence information to human rights organizations and to be able to quickly conclude that who is responsible for those attacks. But this kind of cooperation is not happening at the moment. And I think this is one of the areas that could be improved, and the UK could be in a good position to lead such efforts.
Sorry, could I just... I think this is a really interesting issue, because in the West, it's very clear to people when Western countries intervene, the impact of that. But the impact of not intervening is much less understood. People think, well, it's nothing to do with us, and it's sort of a long way away, and, you know, all that. I mean, what's your sort of view on that? I mean, how well understood do you think it is in the West, the impact of not intervening, the costs of that, the failure to uphold the red lines that were established? I mean, do you think that's well understood here? Do you think people pay sufficient attention to that?
Yeah.
What more do you think could be done to draw that to people's understanding? I mean, when we intervene, we have a big Chilcot inquiry that lasts for years and all that. When we don't intervene, we just sort of walk away from it.
Yeah, I think there is, first of all, that decision makers and governments are well informed about basically the cost of their lack of action inside Syria. And I've been meeting with different decision makers in different countries for the past few years, and it's clear that they are well informed about the cost of their lack of action. But
the government.
Sorry?
The governments.
The governments.
Yes.
I'm talking about the government now. Yeah. So, but they say we cannot do anything about it, which is not true. But this is a different discussion. When it comes to just the public in general, I think many of them are aware that basically the situation is getting worse inside Syria. So it's easy also to link the lack of action when it comes to protecting, for example, civilians on the ground, when it comes to preventing the use of chemical attacks. All those incidents are clear indications that the situation is getting worse, not better, because of the lack of action. But not all of them are interested in basically saying that, yes, we know that because we didn't intervene there, the situation got worse, because that means that they have to confront the fact that they were able to do something and they didn't do something about it before, and they're still not willing to do anything about it right now. And this is, as you know, it's a difficult position where people don't want to confront themselves about something they can do something about, and still they're not doing anything about it. But I think in general, all the reports and all the news have been able to show that the situation is only getting worse because no one is there to stop Assad and stop the attacks and crime committed by Assad. So in that sense, again, they understand it. But when it comes to the technicalities of how that might happen, that will be a different discussion.
Thank you.
Can I ask you then how you would describe the UN's role in alleviating the humanitarian situation on the ground?
I will quickly, just because I addressed this issue previously, but just to give a comprehensive analysis of the situation. I used to work for UNHCR, the UN agency responsible for refugees in Syria, for 5 years. So I know about the way they function. I also know about the way they're allowed to function inside Syria, even before the conflict started there. So in general, the UN and other basically UN other partners have been able to provide aid for almost 6 million a day. That is a big number. They have been trying in order to basically provide as much help as possible, but that doesn't basically change the fact that the way they are doing it is wrong. One clear issue is that they're allowing the regime to dictate who is eligible to receive aid and who is eligible to become a partner to that UN agency. And those are decisions that should not be taken or dictated by a conflict party. Because if you want to be neutral, which is the main aim of all humanitarian aid, is to provide aid to all people despite their political views, religious views, backgrounds, and all stuff. The UN has failed to do that by allowing one party to the conflict to dictate how that aid is being distributed and to whom. And here I'm not only talking about cases that are quite difficult to basically explain or to research. I'm talking about clear local partners that are owned by the cousin of President Bashar al-Assad himself. And that Bustan organization is directly affiliated to an armed group that is owned by that has the same title, the Bustan one as well. So this is why would the UN allow that to happen? And why will the UN not use its leverage in Syria and its principles and values in order to say, we don't want to do this. We have mandate to do, and we will do that mandate despite the restrictions imposed by you. And they have a big leverage in Syria. The only problem is that they are not willing to use that leverage. And they always say that we are in a very difficult situation, and we are afraid if we say no, then the regime will kick us out of the country. But there is basically big range of spectrum and options between saying no and saying yes.
Are we not calling out the human rights abuses because Russia is a UN Security Council power? And it's almost like it is just riding roughshod so much over international law norms that we don't really know how to deal with it. That's my take on this.
Yeah, which is true, but the problem is that I think that the first thing we should do is to identify the problem and then start thinking about solutions to that problem. So far, I've been talking to different governments again and humanitarian, different UN agencies, and they keep repeating the same answer. This is the only way to operate inside Syria, which is not true. So until now, they have failed to, first of all, admit that the way they're operating inside Syria is wrong and is politicized. The second thing is that they failed, when it comes to the Security Council, they failed to admit that the Security Council, in the way it's functioning right now, is not basically getting the job done, and it's not upholding the values and principles that humanity share and they should share and basically implement together. And that should be also another basically reason for the governments involved and other governments as well to say that the way things are happening right now are not leading anywhere, and they are only making the situation worse. Though we should start looking for alternatives. What happened in Rwanda and in other countries in the 90s basically pushed the UN to start thinking about other ways to react, and that's when they came up with the right to protect principles. now I think Syria presents an even more basically complicated crisis that should put us in front of each other, that should put us together, and to say that we should change the way we are behaving and the way we are acting collectively. Because if we don't change that, we are only set to see the history being repeated over and over without being able to do anything to do it. And unfortunately, the lack of willingness of individual countries to act outside of that Security Council is not there anymore. So unless we reform it, we will not be able to do anything.
Okay, can we move it on, Mike?
Yes, thank you. You've talked about 2013 and the failure to act. What's your assessment of the impact that the symbolic airstrike by the United States in 2017 and the US, UK and French airstrikes on 14th April following the attack of the chemicals use in weapons in Douma have had, if anything, on the humanitarian situation on the ground?
Well, unfortunately, the anticipation of the attack had more impact than the attack itself. And that applies not only to 2013, that also applies to 2017 and 16. Because, as you mentioned, the attacks were quite symbolic, and they didn't really lead to pressuring the regime to, first of all, change its behavior, meaning to stop the chemical attacks, especially the 2016 one. 17 one, sorry. After that, in 2017 alone, there were 10 attacks, and in 2018, there were 5 attacks, and they all basically were documented by Human Rights Watch in the report I mentioned. So that shows that, first of all, they failed to prevent chemical attacks from happening in the future. They also didn't try to use that momentum in order to push the political process forward, and that was a big mistake. The third and most important one, and I will end here, is that those basically strikes and the thinking process behind the strikes were only concerned with the mean that is being used to kill Syrians rather than the principle of killing civilians itself. And that has led to basically big impacts on Syria, and this is why the regime has been able to increase different types of chemical attacks and not use that on a larger scale.
Can I ask Ms. Al-Dat, the justification used by the UK, France and the United States has been slightly different for the use of the airstrikes. The UK government said at one point this was because of humanitarian reasons, whereas other countries have said it's to do with the use of the chemical weapons. What's your assessment? I understand you're an expert in these kind of areas. What's your assessment of the justification and how this could have been justified?
The problem with using different sort of justification is, unfortunately, because the responsibility to protect doctrine is still new. It hasn't been used long enough. There hasn't been enough legal precedence to allow us for a thorough legal assessment. The reality is, with a very narrow definition of R2P, the humanitarian intervention or any military intervention needs a Chapter 7 UN Security Council
which Russia will not give you.
Which is blocked.
Yeah.
So two things here. One, that we need to look at R2P. I assume we're speaking about the third pillar in a more, in a wider and more space to make the best out of everything in the third pillar, other than the humanitarian intervention that has been blocked. And there is much to be done in that area. Just a few examples of things that fall under the third pillar, which unfortunately has been used interchangeably with military intervention. There is work to be done on taking part in political dialogue, on criminal investigation, and so on. The UK has unfortunately pulled back from taking an active role in the political dialogue, which could bear results. An example of the shifting of the political dialogue from Geneva, which has been going on for years now, into Asitana and other military-based conversations which are only taking place by military actors and are not taking civil society or the general public in Syria or any others into consideration, which becomes a conversation of who is going to control which territory and so on. So we need more active steps by individual countries to push this political dialogue into what it's supposed to be and what it has been pushed to be. The other point is what has been just raised on Russia saying these are not hospitals, these are military camps. Very good. Let's have more investigation missions to go and see for themselves. Let's have the ICRC there, let's have the Commission of Inquiry. So that is at the core of the third pillar of R2P. Lastly, sanctions. Sanctions is one of the most pacifist, active ways of dealing with grave human rights violations and atrocities. They have been used in a very limited way in Syria, and we would like them to be used more vastly, to be used actively. Unfortunately, even the sanctions that are in place are being reconsidered now. The UK has a unilateral role to take, and it's perfectly legal on sanctions and on the UK being, unfortunately, a safe haven, an investment opportunity for many war criminals in Syria. So this is one thing to be taken forward. And lastly, the protection of refugee and IDPs and all the support that's being given to them is at the core of the R2P doctrine that has to be pushed. I think we shouldn't give up on the doctrine just yet because a military intervention is blocked.
Can I? Sorry, the bell's going to go in about 3 minutes. Stephen, did you want to come very quickly?
Just quickly with the points that you were just raising there. I was quite interested in what you think specifically the UK could be doing, because obviously there's a problem with one member of the Security Council, and you mentioned the UK as a safe haven, and you mentioned sanctions. Could you say just a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, sure. The sanctions there has been a misunderstanding, a universal misunderstanding on sanctions in Syria. Unfortunately, the arguments that get used against the imposition of sanctions is that they are bad for the people. They would block for basically arguments used from the sanctions against Iraq in the 90s. The sanctions imposed in Syria are against individuals who have been involved in atrocities, and it has been proven by UN-mandated bodies. These are there's EU sanctions and there's UN sanctions. And we have lists of names of people who are sanctioned, and that has made a lot of difference because it made the financial transactions and the funding of the military operations much, much difficult. And we would like this to be taken further. The UK itself has a role, and both a legal role and an executive role to play on individuals who either have access to this country or have property in this country or investments that are still ongoing, either in person or by proxy. There are mechanisms that have been tried somewhere else in many other places on identifying these people and just making it much harder to make money out of a conflict and come and spend it or invest it in the UK. And that, again, one of the ways that will make a huge difference, doesn't need a Security Council resolution, and can be done by the sole political will of the UK without any chance of it being criticised for it.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Chair.
Carrying on. What's been the impact in Syria itself on the narrative and the approach to the conflict? Has it had any impact on the propaganda of the Syrian government? Has it made them more aware that there might be consequences from airstrikes from the West, or is it something they just dismissed? How has it been resolved since April this year?
So the narrative of the Syrian regime. Yeah. I think Karo is in a better place to speak about the narrative of the Syrian regime.
I would say for the people, for the ordinary people, in the beginning, it gave a message of hope that finally the international community will react. But of course, later on, they had some disappointment. From the regime side, the regime was so scared in the beginning because it was not able to anticipate what will be the limits of that operation. But after it realized that it was very specific and limited, and actually no one was killed with those airstrikes. So it tried to use it in its propaganda towards the Syrian people as the regime is the victor, it's able to face all Western governments.
Order, I've got to...
You were talking about the impact on the airstrikes this year and the reaction to them, and you talked about the Syrian government's reaction. What's been the perception of the public, the population? Is there any way of knowing?
Well, it's difficult for sure, especially that areas are physically not connected. That has been an intentional and systematic policy that has been used since the early days of the conflict. But in general, when people give their opinion or they make any assessment or assumption, that is mainly based on the people that are able to contact in different areas. So for sure, there is no way to say that this is basically representative or not. But based on what the people that I was able to talk to, for example, after the airstrikes, it was similar to what Farouk mentioned earlier, that at least those who have been suffering from the crimes that were committed and still committed by the regime for a long time felt that at least the regime is paying a price, no matter how small that price is. But they felt disappointed at the same time.
It was not larger.
It's not only not larger because it didn't change anything on the ground.
Right.
Like the 2017 one didn't prevent the regime from using later on, but it also didn't prevent the killing of civilians on a daily basis.
So those airstrikes that were carried out in April, just briefly, all of you had made no difference to the situation on the ground for the people and their suffering?
Not on that level, but in a way or another, they reduce the number of chemical attacks.
Right. So they acted as a deterrent to further chemical attacks?
Exactly, but on the situation on the ground, the daily killing and daily suffering of civilians, that didn't change.
Please.
The main difference was the message to the Syrian people that when the Western governments want to act, they can act. So for many years, there was an excuse that US, UK, France cannot do anything because of the regime air defense or because of the Russians or the Israelis or whoever. That was a message. And there were similar messages by the Americans in the eastern region of Syria when Russian and the Iranians mercenaries wanted to attack the oil fields. They bombed them immediately, and of course there was no reaction from the other side. So that was a key message. Second, you started your question, sir, by raising the point of the confusing messages and confusing justifications. I'm afraid that the repetition of that red line is becoming very destructive inside Syria, because it is understood by a lot of people that it's actually a green light to the regime to use all other kinds of weapons in killing people. The regime killed more than 500,000 Syrian people. Out of them, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 killed by chemical weapons. So when the superpowers in the world keep saying that there is a red line on chemical weapons, and the regime continues slaughtering people and burning them in barrel bombs and cluster munitions and all kinds of other weapons, this is also a very negative message to the people on the ground who are being killed by those weapons every day.
Thank you. Do you wish to? Can I just say that was also the case, though, wasn't it, with President Obama's red line? Because the original red line was from Obama.
Yeah.
And then he did nothing. So it was implicit, even in that time, that it's okay to kill people with barrel bombs, but it's not okay to use chemicals.
Yeah. That was the green light.
We touched briefly on the situation of women in conflict, and we were told in evidence that many of women refugees displaced by the conflict have been more or less forced into human trafficking. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. So there's two aspects to this. One of them is there's two aspects to this. One of them is the large amount of refugees, the failure to provide adequate humanitarian support to them, and also the failure of a legal doctrine in refugee hosting countries. I'm talking about in the region. So there is no camps where there's some kind of monitoring that can take place, or many of the people are in urban areas with very little right, with no access to jobs. There is some support from the UN, but that remains very limited. So we're creating every reason, all of the allowing elements to human trafficking, to also taking advantage of women both in work and in their daily life. It increases violence and it decreases the chances to report violence. So this is definitely happening in refugee hosting countries in the region. Also on the lack of safe passages when people are trying to flee the region. People are fleeing the region because they are in severe danger. Nobody would throw their children on a boat with a 50% chance of them surviving if it wasn't very, very dangerous for them to stay where they are. Unfortunately, the absence of safe passages created disproportionate impact on women. What we hear in Greece and in other countries where people are being processed or are being on the way to their destinations, and that there's no rule of law. There's a crack in the law where people are not nationals and they're not immigrants. They don't have any legal status to benefit from the rule of law in the countries they're at, and this is very severe for women who the situation of detention when they're detained or the situation where they're staying at are exacerbating sexual violence and violence, intimate violence. The fact that traffickers get such a space means that women are in severe danger. So to address this, all countries should take their fair share of those who need resettlement, particularly those who are particularly vulnerable or who need to be prioritized, and that includes women who are subjected to violence.
Can we come on to what more the UK and the international community can do to deter prohibited weapons? Dr. Habib, I was hoping to push you on this because we've had a huge amount of debate here in this country, as you know, about this. What do you think of those who've stood in the way of action against these weapons?
Thanks. First, we need the UK government to help us to raise awareness of the general public here to realize the price of inaction. What were the results and how that was more destructive and how that fueled the refugees crisis and the extremist crisis because of the inaction. Second, practically we expect from the UK more diplomatic pressures on Russia and Iran mainly through all possible ways, and more sanctions on individuals and on companies that are involved in the bloodshedding in Syria. We are surprised that all the arms companies, for example, who are still sending Russian weapons to the regime to kill more people, how they still have their banking accounts functioning, how they still travel and attend fairs and conferences. They should be ashamed for participating in killing people. We expect also from the UK government to use its huge aids and support that is provided in order to ensure respect of the humanitarian law, especially in Syria. So when the UK is funding the UN or international humanitarian organizations in Damascus, that's welcomed, of course, because people there are our brothers and our people. We want them to get their needs met. But the funders or the donors should put strict conditions on the UN and international agencies to respect the international humanitarian law, respect impartiality and neutrality in providing aids, and ensure that the regime is not getting political credits for your taxpayers' money. Also, the support to the neighboring governments, the neighboring countries. there are countries like Jordan, for example, which already has its own economical crisis, and it has millions of refugees from Syria, from Iraq, from Libya, from others, and they need big support from the UK government and other governments in order to meet the needs of the refugees in their country. Currently, there are tens of thousands of people fleeing from the south because of the Russian escalation, and they need assistance.
Ms. Soledad.
So two things that the UK can do on prohibited weapons. On the chemical weapons, there's a long-standing universal acceptance that chemical weapons should be prohibited. Unfortunately, because of the political developments, there is a real threat to that prohibition, and the UK can play an active role in pursuing other bodies other than the Security Council to address that. One of them could be the Secretary General of the UN, who has some mandate to create bodies to address that, and the General Assembly. And the UK is perfectly situated to do that. Another example is the use of explosive weapons in highly populated areas, which is unfortunately not prohibited but should be. And there is now the International Network on Explosive Weapons, which is doing particular work to create political commitment for the prohibition of explosive weapons. Syria is a case study for this. There is the IHL doctrines and the indiscriminate weapons that are prohibited, but unfortunately we're still on the way to prove that the use of explosive weapons in populated area entirely is disproportionate and should be outlawed. I encourage the UK to take active role in this action and to set an example. Last one is the Arms Trade Treaty. We're absolutely delighted that the UK has ratified the Arms Trade Treaty, and now is a very good time to set an example by creating the assessment mechanisms of the arms being transferred to countries or individuals or groups who are actively taking part in atrocities, and this needs to be transparent, gendered, and should be done in consultation with civil society in the country and in countries impacted by it.
Can I be very specific, because I wrote a report with Joe Cox, a colleague of ours who was murdered, called The Cost of Doing Nothing, which we wrote together at the Policy Exchange just over a year ago, it was finished just over a year ago, sadly, after she'd died. That report was written to counter the creeping non-interventionism of both parties, but particularly the hard left of the Labour Party. Could you just say very, very clearly the cost of non-intervention, the cost of non-action? You've listed as, in various ways, all three of you have listed as further war crimes in Syria, the invasion and annexation of Crimea, the murder of hundreds of people inside Syria, the aggression from Iran, the exploitation of the Iranian people off the back of this. Is there anything I'm missing here?
One thing I think could be added is the serious threat to long-standing legal doctrines that we need to be kept.
So the fundamental undermining of the international rules?
Fundamental undermining of international laws that are long-standing, and also a threat to those that are developing towards accountability. Unfortunately, we're withdrawing from accountability. It's a few steps behind where we were in 2011 and in 2005.
So would I be right in saying that the cost of doing nothing is most immediately obvious in Syria and amongst the murdered in Syria, but actually it fundamentally undermines the security position of the British people, and it is a fundamental threat to the rules that we have relied on for 70 years to keep us safe?
Yes.
It's fair to say that, yes.
You would agree with that?
Yes.
All three of you?
Yeah, just one last thing to add. I think it undermined the ability to reach political settlement to the conflict in Syria, because the inaction there allowed the regime, with the help of Iran and Russia, to capture many areas. And what we are seeing right now is that basically a zero-sum game in order to recapture the rest of the country, and there is nothing that is being done to prevent that.
So can I just jump in there again? So you would say pretty clearly that those who say they're waiting for a political solution are actually waiting for the death of more civilians in order to find a solution. That's what they're actually doing.
Yes, and waiting for more military actions to happen.
Right, so the political solution that they claim to be waiting for is actually called murder.
And a military one, yeah.
Bob, you wanted to come in? Oh, sorry, Mike.
Can I just quickly? We've talked about Iran and Russia, and it's not just Iran; it's Hezbollah as well.
Yeah.
Nobody's talked about Turkey, because Turkey is involving itself quite significantly now militarily in occupying Syrian territory on its border. What's been the impact of that? Has that led to a significant increase in the humanitarian crisis, movement of people, or has it been less bad?
I won't talk from political perspective, but from a humanitarian perspective,
Yes.
we have to say that it might be the only safe zone now in Syria.
Where the Turkish troops are?
Yeah, because that area is not being bombed by anyone, and there are no ISIS groups there.
Is that because
This doesn't mean that
withdrew and then the Turkish troops
yes, of
went
course, based on the Russian-Turkish agreement, so the regime does not bomb those areas. So I'm not saying that the humanitarian situation is perfect. No, of course there are many complications, but it is a safe zone for and no bombing zone for Syrians out there.
Are the Syrian people going there?
Just, I don't know if you are done on that. Just, I think there are two areas of operation that Turkey is involved in inside Syria. The first one is called the Euphrates Shield operation, and that operation was mainly against ISIS groups and affiliate groups in areas like Jarablus and Al-Bab. So that basically improved the humanitarian situation, but has many flaws as well. For example, Turkey has monopoly over aid services in those areas, but improved the situation for those who lived there and allowed others to return to that area. And then there is another area which is called, or the operation for that area was called the Olive Branch operation.
In Afrin.
In Afrin, exactly. And that area was mainly against Kurdish-led groups that were controlling that area. And that led to catastrophic humanitarian situations. Many people were displaced, and many violations were committed by local groups who were fighting along the Turkish forces in those areas. And Human Rights Watch just recently published a report where they listed all the violations that were committed. So that had negative impact on the situation on the ground and led to the displacement of thousands of people who are outside of their homes now.
Thank you.
Finally, at a point, you mentioned Hezbollah.
Yeah.
On Lebanon, the UK government is providing big support to the Lebanese army to control the borders with Syria. And what's happening actually that your funding is being used to control the borders only from one side to disallow Syrians who want to escape from Syria to go to Lebanon. But at the same time, those forces which are funded by you, they are facilitating the crossing of Hezbollah and its fighters from Lebanon to Syria to kill more Syrians.
So are you saying the British government is funding an operation which an unintended consequence of which?
The UK government is funding the Lebanese army with equipment and training to control the borders. And what I'm saying that it's controlled only from one side to disallow Syrians to cross. But the extremist militias of Hezbollah are allowed by this army funded by you to cross to the other side and kill the Syrians there. And without that flow from Hezbollah and the Iranian militias to the regime would not be able to continue and kill all this number of Syrians.
Bob, did you want to
I just wanted to follow up the point that you were making, and just more broadly, it seems that everything one has seen in Syria over the past few years seems to me that the responsibility to protect is sort of more or less dead in the water. It's been killed by the Assad regime, and it's been killed by a Security Council power. So does responsibility to protect actually mean anything? It seems to me it doesn't.
I have to disagree. I don't think the responsibility to protect and military intervention are interchangeable. Military intervention is all what you said. Yes, it has been curbed, and it's currently seems not to be an option. I think R2B is a much bigger doctrine. Many of the things that are included in the third pillar of it have been used and have made a difference for civilians, including the protection of refugees, including the political dialogue, some bits of it, including criminal investigation and so on. So yes, humanitarian military intervention is not a possibility at the moment, but the doctrine is very important and it has protected a lot of Syrians. Now, has this been...
Has it saved life?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, can I just ask on that? I'm sorry to interrupt. 400,000 civilians have died. And so it's great that you're saying that, but I just don't see how you're saying it. I'm very happy to prove me wrong.
I'm not saying it succeeded. You asked me if it saved life, and it did. It definitely did. The fact that we have investigated, that there's a commission of inquiry that has investigated crimes against humanity and other crimes, the fact that there has been policies to address refugees, the fact that the displaced population has been addressed. I'm not saying that the R2P population, it aims to protect civilians from atrocities, and that has not happened. So no, it did not achieve its ultimate goals. Did all of these things protect civilians? Yes, they protected some civilians. It could have been much, much worse if no other acts has been done. What I'm trying to say is it's important not to equate the situation with Syria or taking action in Syria with military intervention. Otherwise, all the countries, most countries, all the countries who cannot intervene will say, well, there's nothing to be done and withdraw, and we cannot afford that because there's 22 million Syrians who still need help and support. But yes, much more can be done and should be done.
Do you have the same opinions?
Well, when it comes to non-military intervention, I agree that the right to protect, or at least some elements of that right to protect mechanisms have had a positive impact on the ground, but that impact is quite limited. And in a way, in comparison to the larger scale of atrocities, is quite insignificant. And the main, basically, mean that would have allowed the right to protect civilians at large would have been through military means, or at least the willingness to threat to use military means, even if you don't have to use them. But the willingness to do that was missing, and that's why that right to protect was not able to fulfill its mandate inside Syria.
And Dr. Farouk, do you agree?
I agree.
Who do you agree with?
I agree with Hyde. Yeah.
But I also agree with Zainab. Because we were not saying things.
It's a bit of work, but I mean, significant elements happen because you have tens of thousands of dead civilians. Thank you.
Is there any form of UK intervention that would improve the humanitarian situation on the ground?
I think there is, but the question is there a willingness to do it? Because
what is it? Spell it
I
out.
will mention a few options, but the problem is that since the beginning of the peaceful demonstrations inside Syria, there were many options on the table, and there were very concrete and clear options that different countries could have done in order to change the course of the conflict. But there was no willingness to do that. And here, I'm afraid that the willingness only decreased, not increased, because of the complication of what we are seeing there right now. Therefore, it's difficult to imagine any proposal that will basically lead to concrete actions if there is still no willingness to do it. This is in general. When it comes to what could be done there in particular, Farouk just mentioned that there were somehow 3 de facto no-fly zones in Syria, or no bombarding. bombing zones, because that term is a bit different. So there were 3 main de facto no bombing zones in Syria. One established by the Americans in eastern Syria, one established by the Turkish-led forces in northern Syria, and one that was in a way brokered by the Americans, the Jordanians, and the Russians in southern Syria. Now, 2 of them are still holding, the one in eastern Syria and the one in northern Syria, while the one in southern Syria is not holding anymore. So the UK could, because the US clearly mentioned that they are not interested in basically maintaining that ceasefire or de-escalation zone anymore. So I think that the UK and other partner countries could replace the efforts that were invested by the US before in that area in order to maintain that de-escalation zone. Whether they engage directly with the Russians, or whether they do it through the UN or whatever mechanism, but there is a possibility to still maintain that de-escalation zone. If that doesn't happen, then unfortunately what we will be seeing most likely soon is that the regime will also start attacking northern Syria, which will create another human